Hi, welcome back to educator.com. This is the lesson on the muscular system. There are many functions of muscles. The most obvious one is movement. It's not just movement of the body as a whole. Obviously, doing this requires muscles, but all of the movement within the body regulated by muscles. Something as simple as blood flow. Within your arteries especially, there are very important muscles for regulating how thin or how thick those blood vessels are. And that helps distribute the right amount of blood to the particular places in the body that need a slight adjustment. So within the body, muscles very important, the ones that you can't consciously control. For instance, muscles control whether or not my hairs are standing straight up and my pores are closed, or if they're just kind of relaxed like they are now. And those are, once again, muscles that we don't think about because we don't really have to think about it consciously to make it work. So there are, of course, voluntary muscles, also known as skeletal muscles, and then these would fall under smooth muscles or cardiac muscles, which we'll talk about more on a slide in the future. Maintaining body position. Just sitting like I am now, I have a bunch of muscles that are contracted and a bunch of muscles that are relaxed. And if I adjust my position, then I'm changing obviously which muscles are relaxed and which muscles are contracted. Support of soft tissues. If you think about the abdominal muscles, even if you don't have a six-pack, having all of these muscles right here is the next best thing to having bones there. And if we had bones there, it'd be a little different in terms of how we move this part of our chest, but supportive soft tissues, having muscles here adjacent to the more fragile, important vital organs of the intestine variety, that's very important. Regulating entrances and exits, not just the mouth, the connection between the esophagus and the stomach. At the bottom of the tube that gets food into your stomach, you have the lower esophageal sphincter. And a sphincter is kind of like a round muscular doorway. And so that helps regulate food going into the stomach. There's also a sphincter on the bottom end of the stomach that helps regulate how much food, digested food, is going into the small intestine for further breakdown and absorption of nutrients. Another one, the anal sphincter. Of course, that's going to regulate when and where you're going to defecate. Maintaining body temperature. Of course, shivering. That is something that's going to help you not freeze to death. And really, shivering is a bunch of really quick contractions and relaxations that you don't have conscious control over, but it's important because it actually will raise your body temperature a bit by having all of that muscular movement. The three major types of muscle cells or muscle fibers, they're one and the same. You can call every individual muscle cell a fiber that has a bunch of protein fibers jam-packed in it. So we could refer to the major muscles of the body as being skeletal, smooth, or cardiac, and then the cells within each one of those can be called skeletal, smooth, or cardiac. This particular image here, the green one, that's skeletal or striated muscle. So striations are these little lines. If you look carefully, this is a skeletal muscle fiber. And then you can see that when you look at each one of them, there are these tiny lines that are perpendicular to the orientation of the fiber. These little lines you can call striations, and we'll get into more in the future what are those lines and why they're important. These blue things here, they are nuclei. Each one is an individual nucleus, and it's very typical for muscles in the body to be multinucleated, having more than one nucleus in a single cell. And there's a lot going on, so having some additional nuclei to help coordinate all of those muscular movements, important. This picture here is smooth muscle. It looks smooth to the touch, almost like if you touched it, it wouldn't be very bumpy, it would be quite smooth. Those are involuntary. You do not have conscious control over smooth muscles. So like I mentioned before, the muscles that are inside of an artery, the erector pili muscles of the skin, the muscles in the organs of the body. You can't consciously contract your stomach. You can't consciously contract your small intestine. It happens by your brain regulating it, but it's not your conscious brain. And that's good. It's good not to have to think about those things. So smooth muscles, a little bit different in structure. These are involuntary muscles. Cardiac, of course, that's found in one place of the body. It's the heart muscles. So the muscle fibers of the heart, also not a voluntary thing. Yes, you can voluntarily do things to elevate your heart rate, but your heart rate is going to be adjusted based on your body's need for blood. What does this mean? It basically means intercalated disc. This right here is an intercalated disc. Here's one cardiac muscle fiber, here's another. And you'll see them connected via these intercalated discs. It looks a little bit different than the skeletal or striated muscle. And also a classic look with cardiac muscle histology, looking at these microscope images, you see little spaces, and those little spaces help facilitate the electric flow throughout those cardiac muscle fibers to initiate heartbeats. When we look at the average skeletal muscle, and of course the reason why it's called that is they're attached to bone, there are some major terms we need to be familiar with. So of course, number 1 here, that's a bone. Number 8, what is this? Well, it's not a ligament because it's muscle attached to bone, not bone attached to bone. So in this case, we would call this a tendon. Number 8 is a tendon, and that is one of the many forms of connective tissue. But when we look at the muscle body as a whole, and there's a nice cross-section here that we could, see into the inside of it, fascia is the term for the wrapping around a muscle. Fascia is to muscle as the casing is to sausage. Kind of a weird example, but that clear casing around a sausage is kind of like how fascia is around a muscle. It's a connective tissue that's keeping it all wrapped together as one unit. Just underneath that, you're going to see connective tissue called epimysium. Epi means the outermost, typically. So all of this white stuff around the outside, that is epimysium. Epimysium is connective tissue that's surrounding all of these little bundles called fascicles. So number 6 is labeling one fascicle. Here's a fascicle. Here is a fascicle. Here's another fascicle. And basically fascicles are bundles of muscle fibers. So each one of these little red tubular units that we're seeing a cross-section of, these are each the muscle cells or muscle fibers. What is separating all the fascicles from each other within a muscle? That's called perimysium. So the perimysium is kind of the intermediate in the middle connective tissue. So right here, there would be perimysium, there'd be perimysium here, perimysium here, perimysium here, and here. So it's just separating the fascicles from each other. As I already mentioned, muscle fibers are contained within each fascicle. Same thing as saying muscle cells. So number 4 is actually labeling one muscle fiber that's kind of like being pulled out. This almost looks like one of those antennas, those metal antennas where you pull out the smaller tube from the bigger tube and so on. So yeah, here's one muscle fiber being pulled out of a fascicle being pulled out of a muscle as a whole. And the last connective tissue I want to tell you about is endomysium. So this little white area that's separating the individual muscle fibers from each other within one fascicle, that's endomysium. And endo typically means inner. So that is the inner connective tissue in here. Myofibrils. Myofibrils are groups of protein fibers that are found within every muscle fiber. So we're getting tinier and tinier and tinier here. And this is important because in one muscle fiber, one muscle cell, you can have billions of protein fibers. It's amazing to think about. So having all those protein fibers arranged in individual units is important. And that's what myofibrils do. And finally, sarcomeres. You can't really see them here, but sarcomeres are the individual units that are within a myofibril. That's coming up. So here's a different view of what we were looking at the previous slide. So this is pretty much the same image. Here is a muscle fiber, and this is a myofibril. So this whole thing, one muscle cell, and here's all those myofibrils being pulled out of it. So if we zoom into one myofibril, here's a super close-up. The sarcomere is from here to here. So you can see it's kind of tiny, but that says 1 sarcomere. So it's from this border to this border, and here's another sarcomere, and here's another sarcomere from this border to the next one. And this border is oftentimes depicted as a zigzaggy line. It's also called a Z-line. So that's how I remember the term Z-line, because it usually is depicted as zigzaggy in a lot of textbook images. You'll see one a little bit later in this presentation. So yeah, sarcomere from Z-line to Z-line. And what's inside of a sarcomere, you may ask? Many different types of protein fibers that help contract and relax a muscle as a whole. Here's a look at them. See these thick filaments in the center? I'm going to label them red. I'm not going to color in the whole thing, but all of these are called myosin. So there's your myosin filaments. And then the thinner ones that are connected, these are called actin filaments. So here's actin. Actin, myosin is right there. And you can see if you look further on the other sarcomeres, it's a very repetitive system. Here's a zoom in of what we're looking at here. So if you zoom into that blue set of actin filaments that are all together, up close you can see that it's these little spheres. So each one of these spheres is a unit of actin. And you can see it's arranged in kind of a helical, spirally looking shape similar to DNA. And there are a couple other proteins on top of actin that are very tiny. Troponin, and then this strand called tropomyosin. And we'll get into what the function of those are a little bit later. Here's another depiction of the myosin filaments, and they're these little, they look like clubs, almost like a golf club. Oftentimes they're called myosin heads. And when the myosin heads connect to actin, they call it a cross bridge. And basically, we're going to get to the steps in a moment. It's all about myosin connecting to actin and moving it in. When you move the actin in closer and closer and closer, that causes muscles to be contracted. So if I contract my bicep at a microscopic level, you have just thousands and thousands and thousands of these little activities that bring the actin closer to the myosin. And that's called the sliding filament theory that explains how muscles function. So sarcomere structure. As I mentioned a second ago, myosin, the larger filaments. And here myosin is being depicted as blue. They are thicker. Actin is being depicted as these little red ones. Those are the smaller filaments. And here's that term Z-line. Imagine the Z-line as a zigzaggy. Help you remember that it's Z. And so that's one sarcomere. Here's an actual micrograph. This is an actual picture taken with a microscope. Obviously, this is computer generated. So Z-lines, that's the borders of the sarcomere. A-band. So you can see that A-band is basically the width of myosin. And a trick to remember that is the A-band is dark. And I'm making the A capitalize. Dark has the letter A. Remember that those are darker, thicker. So the A-band is that length of myosin. We'll get to M-line in a sec. I-band is the length of the actin that's not overlapping with the myosin. So you could think of I-band as being light. So I'm writing it all in lowercase except for the I. I-band, the word light, because they're lightly colored and they're thinner. You can remember that that's the portion of actin filaments there within sarcomeres. The M-line is simply what is keeping the myosin together. What's anchoring the myosin in that sort of immovable area and allowing it to pull in actin? It's the M-line. So that blue line I just drew is in the H zone within the A-band. That's called the M-line. And that's a sarcomere. Here's another depiction of it. You can see that up top, the Z-lines are farther away. And down bottom, since we have slight contraction, it's farther in. You can see that the difference between these two pictures is that there's a shorter sarcomere. And so when a muscle contracts, every sarcomere within it has gotten less wide because the myosin has pulled in the actin, and that microscopic movement has led to the macroscopic movement of the muscle. So the sliding filament theory explains in detail how the sarcomere actually contracts. And as I said before, when you look closer at actin filaments, there are more proteins. Tropomyosin tends to be like strand looking. So you'll see tropomyosin kind of looking like this. And let's say that actin is in red. And so we have all these red units. They should all be the same size, but that's good enough. So in red is actin. In blue is the tropomyosin. And I'm going to show you that same image on the next slide to remind you of what it looks like. Troponin is more like a globular-looking protein. So I'm going to write these little green ovals. That's troponin. And what happens is when you want to contract a muscle, you have neurotransmitters from the end of the axon, and that'll make more sense when we cover the nervous system in future lessons. But at the end of a neuron, the end of a bunch of nerves coming to a muscle, you have a neurotransmitter, a signal molecule, and in this case it would be acetylcholine that's going to stimulate this muscle to contract. The acetylcholine docks on the surface of the muscle, which is called the sarcolemma. And that in turn unleashes a bunch of calcium ions. So you have calcium reserves, not just in bone. Calcium is extremely important for muscle function. And there's this reserve. It's like, think of it as a giant dam, a giant reservoir of calcium. And it's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. If you've taken basic biology, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is like the endoplasmic reticulum, or ER, of a cell, but modified for a muscle's purposes. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum is the ER, and within those membranous folds, you've got a huge reserve of calcium. Once the neurotransmitter from the nervous system docks, the floodgates open and calcium is dumped into the myofibrils, all those units in a muscle that have the proteins. Calcium, I'm going to use yellow to depict what calcium is. So calcium, these little charged ions, these charged atoms, they dock on troponin. And what happens is, once calcium binds to troponin, it shifts, it moves, and causes a shift in tropomyosin. Because if you think about it, troponin is directly attached to these blue strands that are wrapped around actin. So if troponin moves, it pulls on tropomyosin. And once tropomyosin shifts, it exposes these areas on actin that are called binding sites. A lot of textbooks make it look like the binding site's like a pimento on the olive of actin. And that's a fun way to think of it. So once tropomyosin shifts, the little pimento, the binding site is exposed on actin, and that allows myosin to connect to it. And we'll look at that at the next slide. So here we go. You can see tropomyosin right here is covering all those binding sites. So once calcium binds to troponin, moves that, tropomyosin moves out of the way, and then these little guys, the heads of myosin, can then attach. And they can do what's called a power stroke, which is when you're really getting down to business in terms of contracting a muscle. So once the actin binding sites are exposed, you can see I wrote here that myosin heads dock and make a power stroke. So on the myosin heads, you have parts of what are called ATP. It's not connected as ATP. If you're unfamiliar with that term, it's an energy molecule. That's very common in cells, and it's made up of two pieces, ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and another little phosphate. So imagine my hands are the myosin heads. And when they dock on actin, they do what's called a power stroke. So imagine I'm docking on actin, and I'm going like this. And when I go like this, I'm pulling in actin, physically pulling it in closer and making those Z lines come closer together. So actin filaments are pulled together, and then once you've done the power stroke, to let go, and have it come back, recock into position and go back, you need to have a fresh ATP molecule power it to take it off. So in order to take off that head that's just made a power stroke, take it off of actin, you need ATP. You need that fresh energy molecule. And then to cock it back into position, or I said they recock back into position for another docking, the ATP, the energy supplied by it, by breaking apart, gets it back into position. Now imagine that happening thousands of times in a second. It's amazing to think about this happening, but it makes sense because every power stroke is going to shorten a sarcomere by 0.5%. Now imagine how small a sarcomere is. So one power stroke, pulling in of actin by myosin, doesn't even adjust it by 1%. So you have to have it attach, power stroke, come off, recock it. So it's doing that just to do that simple contraction, just to do contractions of muscles. So there's a lot going on to power that contraction and make these filaments slide together. So how do you relax the muscle? This is the opposite of contraction. Relaxation is a passive process. So I just told you about contraction of muscle. That was very active. We needed kind of this domino effect of a neurotransmitter making calcium come out into the muscle fibers, myofibrils more specifically, attaching to this protein, which adjusts this protein, and so on and so forth. But relaxation of a muscle is just once those particular dominoes are no longer falling, relaxation can happen. So some of the dominoes that were required to make contraction happen, one of them is the neurotransmitter. So if you end stimulation at the neuromuscular junction, that's what we're seeing here. Number one is showing you the terminal end of an axon, the end of a neuron that's going to stimulate this muscle. Right here, this membrane, the purple one, that is the surface of the muscle. We can call it the sarcolemma. And this whole thing here is the neuromuscular junction. It's the connecting of your nervous system to the muscular system. These little pinkish looking dots, they're called synaptic vesicles. So number 3, this is equal to synaptic vesicles. And they each contain neurotransmitters. In this case, it would be acetylcholine. So to get the whole process started, those end up doing what's called exocytosis. They fuse with the edge here and dump those neurotransmitters out into this space called the synapse. You have to get these neurotransmitters to stop docking on these receptors if you want to stop contracting a muscle. So that's the first thing that needs to happen. If we're talking acetylcholine with making muscles get stimulated, there's an enzyme that can be in the synapse to break down the neurotransmitter. It's called acetylcholine esterase. Interestingly enough, little side note, there is a pesticide that works by inhibiting, not letting it work. And what it's inhibiting is acetylcholine esterase. So the enzyme that's supposed to get rid of all these green stimulators, if you don't let that enzyme work, then when you spray it on the insect, let's say I'm the insect and I'm making this motion with my legs, all of a sudden I'm in a prolonged contraction and I'm going to twitch to death. I can no longer relax muscles and then, recontract them if you're not allowing the breakdown or getting rid of this neurotransmitter to stimulate muscles. Remember that calcium was released from a reserve down in here called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So if you get the calcium ions back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, into their reservoir, that's another key point. You got to get the calcium out of the muscles. Also, ATP is a key to relaxing muscles because remember, when the myosin heads attached to actin and they did a power stroke, the key to getting them off of the actin was you had to have ATP. If there's no ATP left in the muscle, you're not going to be able to let myosin off of actin to let it go, and you have to let it go to let the Z lines go back to normal and to let the whole muscle relax. Rigor mortis applies to this. Rigor mortis is when a dead body is stiff as a board. Why does that happen? Well, any position that a animal or being dies in, they're going to have certain muscles that are in a contracted position and certain muscles that are currently relaxed. For instance, when my arm is down, my biceps muscle here is relaxed, but this is contracted. So if I die in this position, there's a lot of residual ATP left over in the muscle that I've already generated in preparation for future events. But even when the heart stops beating and the brain stops working, there's still some ATP left over. But after several hours, that's done. And you didn't make any more because you're dead. So once there's no more ATP, you can no longer move this. Because if I wanted to like move this on a dead body, if there's no ATP to let go of myosin off of actin, it's not. It's going to be like there, like a statue. It's not going to want to let go without the ATP. So you may ask, well, does rigor mortis just permanently last? No. After about 24 hours up to 72 hours later after death, you're going to get certain enzymes being released that break down. This is just part of death, that break down those proteins, especially along the Z lines and such, that are going to just dissolve myofibrils to the point where the body is breaking down. So once that happens, rigor mortis is no longer in effect. More on muscles. Oxygen debt, you know that if you're just sitting here like I am, or probably like you are, it's going well in terms of oxygen and using it, and it's great. But if I go on a run, you or I go on a very long distance run or a sprint, your heart's going to start beating more. You're going to start breathing in more, of course, because you're trying to get more oxygen to your muscles, and you're trying to get increased blood flow to your muscles. And the key to making that ATP molecule is you got to break down sugars through glycolysis. This is something you learn in basic bio. You break down the sugars, and then the products called pyruvic acid from glycolysis you send to the mitochondria, which are quite abundant in muscles, of course, because they're doing so much using of energy, using that ATP. And then you use oxygen to finish what's called aerobic respiration, the process of using oxygen to get a lot of ATP out of a sugar molecule. But if I'm running really fast, even though I may be breathing in a lot more oxygen, eventually what I'm asking my muscles to do is exceeding the amount of ATP that's currently available to my muscles. And then what's going to start happening is, if I don't have enough ATP and I don't have quite enough oxygen available at that moment to make more ATP, instead of pyruvic acid from glycolysis going to the mitochondria, it's going to be turned into what's called lactic acid. And that oxygen debt, as a result of me not having quite enough of the raw materials to make more ATP, I'm going to make lactic acid as part of anaerobic respiration. And that's that burning sensation you get in your muscles. Sprinting really hard once around a track, most people are going to feel that burning sensation unless you're an Olympic athlete. And that's lactic acid being generated. Studies have shown that the lactic acid being generated actually can stimulate you to inhale even more oxygen to try to get that lactic acid out of the muscle and get it back into pyruvic acid. The liver can actually turn lactic acid back into pyruvic acid, and you can use that once you've slowed down and you stop making lactic acid, and that burning sensation will go away. Creatine phosphate. This is something that's naturally available in human bodies. Everybody has it. And creatine phosphate is like an assistant to making more ATP. So if you do, in a moment's time, not have enough newly generated ATP, you're having trouble quickly attaching phosphates back onto ADP, creatine phosphate has phosphates to give up. So it can quickly remake ATP at a moment's notice as kind of like an assistant. And I know some people will actually take creatine supplements. You know, it works for some people, but I would caution people on relying on creatine powders or what have you to assist in workouts, because just because you're taking in a bunch of creatine powder doesn't mean you're using all of it. A lot of it could be coming out through your urine because you have creatine phosphate that's readily available, and a healthy person who's eating well and exercising correctly doesn't really need that supplement. Fast versus slow twitch fibers. Fast twitch fibers tend to be white in appearance, lighter color. And your classic looking muscle is a slow twitch fiber that's red. I like to think about ducks versus chickens with this. If you look at a chicken breast, that's white meat. Duck tends to have a lot more of the dark meat. When you look at how a chicken moves, the reason why it has a lot more white fibers here is because, think about a chicken trying to fly. You know, it's flapping its wings really quickly, and that's thanks to all those fast twitch fibers. You and I have a lot of fast twitch fibers in the hand region. You know, think about that. Think about how quickly we can blink our eyelids, and think about how quickly we can move the parts of our feet. So you're going to have areas of the body with a lot more fast twitch fibers, and some areas you're going to have more slow twitch fibers. Now, slow twitch is not a bad thing. A cow, a duck, an elk is going to have probably a greater proportion of slow twitch fibers than a chicken, but it suits these animals and suits us for very specific purposes. So a slow twitch fiber, you can't move quite as fast, but it's a load-bearing kind of thing. You're able to exert yourself with those fibers and do work. It might not be as fast, but you're able to lift things and push on things thanks to slow twitch fibers. I've actually heard that in parts of Europe, some families will have tests run on their son or daughter to determine if genetically they have slightly more slow twitch fibers or slightly more fast twitch fibers than the average human being. Now, we're all the same species, but within our species, you can have slight variations in the precise percentage of slow twitch fibers available in your body versus fast twitch. So if you do a test confirming that your child maybe has, 0.2% more slow twitch fibers or 0.2% more fast twitch fibers, you might think, hey, maybe my child's more suited towards sprinting genetically or more suited towards long distance running. It's still not widely used, but that's an interesting test to do. When it comes to naming muscles, there's usually a combination of 4 characteristics that are used to name a muscle: function, location, size, and orientation. So here are some examples. The pectoralis major, the major muscle of the upper chest. Pectoralis is the region. This is the pectoral region or location. Major here means it's big, it's large, and that's a size term. So pectoralis major is a combination of the location, size naming. Orbicularis oris. Orbicularis comes off of the fact that it orbits. So that's kind of the orientation of it, kind of how it sits on a part of your body. And oris comes from oral. So this is partially function, partially location, but the orbicularis oris is right here around your lips. So it is a circular, orbiting kind of muscle, and it's right on the oral cavity. And this long one, flexor digitorum superficialis, that actually helps you do this. It helps you flex your digits, and it's a more superficial muscle compared to some other ones. So that's a function kind of naming, that's a location kind of naming, and that is also an orientation kind of naming because it's more superficial than deep. So the major muscles of the head, I'll quickly go through these. Here is the epicranius. It's right in the front or top of the cranial part of the head. I've heard this called epicranius frontalis because it's right on the frontal bone. And then this one in the back, I've heard called epicranius occipitalis because that's the occipital bone. If you're wondering, well, what is this in here? Those are called aponeuroses. Aponeuroses is connective tissue that connects muscle to muscle. You also find them in between the abdominal muscles. Those are aponeuroses as well. The temporalis muscle is right here, right on the temple. And that is an accessory muscle or synergist with this. I'm going to skip ahead just briefly. The masseter muscle is right here. And this masseter muscle is the main jaw clenching muscle to bring your mandible up. So the masseter, similar to the term mastication, chewing, the masseter muscle is, you could say, is the prime mover or the main mover for this action. But if you put your fingers right here and then clench, you can feel that there is a contraction going on right at your temple. So the term synergist or accessory muscle could be used to say, hey, you know what? The prime mover for lifting up your jaw is the masseter muscle, but there is a slight contraction here with the temporal muscle, or temporalis muscle, rather. The antagonist or opposite mover to the masseter is whatever is lowering your jaw, right? So if the prime mover for bringing your jaw up is the masseter, right here, the platysma, platy means flat, this muscle has some flatness to it. So the platysma is actually bigger than it looks in this image. The platysma actually is right here. And when you open your mouth or let your jaw fall, your platysma is contracting, but the masseter has to relax. So that's the importance of the terms prime mover and antagonist. It's the same with your biceps versus your triceps. If I'm going like this, this is the prime mover, and this is the antagonist doing the opposite. Back to the head, orbicularis oculi. Orbicularis oculi is what allows you to blink. It's similar to the naming of orbicularis oris, but since it's in the ocular area of the eye, it has that name. Zygomaticus has its name because, I'll actually use a different color for this one. We're using a lot of red. Let's use purple. Here is the zygomaticus. Why is it called that? This is named after its location. It's attached to the zygomaticus bone. So smiling, you can thank your zygomaticus, because the zygomaticus, you can see where it's located. It kind of pulls up on the edges of your lips. The orbicularis oris, mentioned earlier, is right here, and that allows you to do this, to make the kissy face. The buccinator. Buccinator actually means trumpeter. So the buccinator muscle is hidden right here. It's just deep to the superficial zygomaticus. So here is that buccinator muscle. It's a slightly different motion than with the orbicularis oris. So the orbicularis oris does this, but they call it the trumpeter muscle because when you do this and you make that little indentation, like you're blowing on a trumpet, that is your buccinator working there. Those are the muscles, the main muscles of the head. When we look at the muscles of the torso, I'm also including parts of the tops of the arms here, but deltoid on this muscular man here is right here and right here. When you look at the muscle by itself, it has a triangular look, kind of like a delta. So that's why it's called the deltoid. The trapezius muscle is best viewed from the back, but that's what you're seeing here on this gentleman. People who work out their upper back a lot, you can see a bulge here, and the trapezius makes up the majority of the upper back. If you use your imagination, it kind of looks like a trapezoid, except it does come down to a point near the mid-back. So that is the trapezius muscle. Pectoralis major was mentioned in a previous slide. That is this muscle. You can barely see it in yellow, but you know where it is. Next up, external oblique. External because it's towards the outside. Oblique because it's diagonal in its orientation. So here are your external obliques. So some people, focus on those side muscles of the abdominal region when they're doing certain exercises. The latissimus dorsi. Latissimus means widest, and dorsi, like dorsal back. Those are these kind of wing-like muscles that pop out of the sides of the back. On a back view, they are quite large, next to the trapezius. And all of this here is latissimus dorsi. Rectus abdominis is the last one I'll tell you about here on the torso. If you look at how the six-pack is arranged, it's in these little pockets of muscle, and they're connected by aponeuroses, that connective tissue. Rectus means straight parallel, and abdominis is the region. So the reason why it's rectus abdominis is when you look closely at the muscle fibers, they're all just going straight up and down. And so it is straight / diagonal. And here you're looking at add some more here, rectus abdominis. The major muscles of the arms, biceps brachii and triceps brachii. So the brachii has to do with the fact that we're looking at the arm here. Biceps, triceps. And biceps actually means two heads, because when you look at how this muscle is attached up here, there's actually 2 points of attachment, or 2 heads. Conversely, when you look at the triceps brachii, I'll go back over this in purple. The triceps brachii has 3 points of connection, so that's why it's triceps. Brachioradialis, that muscle is right here. So remember from the skeletal lessons, the ulna is on the pinky side, the radius is on the thumb side. So since radialis is in the name of this, here's, I'm trying to flex it, but here's the brachioradialis. Flexor digitorum superficialis, like I said earlier, that allows you to flex your digits. And so me doing this, I'm contracting that particular muscle. And the major muscles of the legs, gluteus maximus, a lot of people are familiar with it. That is the major butt muscle. Maximus because it's large. There is a gluteus minimus, but it's slightly off to the side. So that's the glute. Rectus femoris. Remember, rectus means straight, parallel. And femoris, of course, the femur. A lot of people call the front thigh muscle the quadriceps. And that's fine. Quadriceps means 4 heads. But there are individual muscles there. So the rectus femoris is one of the major ones, and it comes like that up on the top of the leg. The sartorius lies right on top of that. I'm going to do that in purple. Sartorius has to do with being a tailor, interestingly enough. The sartorius muscle comes along here like a tailor's thread. And I think that's a very interesting name that they gave it. Biceps femoris, remember, biceps means 2 heads. So that's why just calling this biceps in an anatomy class, it's not the full name, because there are multiple muscles that start with the name biceps. Biceps brachii, biceps femoris is actually in the hamstring area. So you can see right here, they say hamstrings. That's the more common name for the back part of the thigh. But the major muscle there, yeah, is the biceps femoris. Gastrocnemius, also known as the calf muscle. So here is the gastrocnemius. You can barely see it here on the side. But the calf muscle, or gastrocnemius, is attached to your heel via the Achilles tendon or calcaneal tendon. See, it says tendocalcaneus there. So the calcaneal tendon, named after the fact that that heel bone is called the calcaneus, and that is a very strong tendon. And if you rupture it, quite painful, and you're not able to walk. The soleus is right next door to the gastrocnemius. I'll do that one in purple as well. The soleus is actually more visible when you look at the front. So the soleus is actually right here. but you can see it also along the back of the leg. And those are the major muscles of the body. There's a lot more than what I covered, but these are the major ones. And now for some muscular disorders. There are lots of disorders of the muscular system. These are some of the major ones. Muscular dystrophy is a genetic disorder. There are lots of types of muscular dystrophy, but what they all have in common is genetically the person is unable to make dystrophin, a muscular protein, in the proper way. Now, dystrophin makes up less than like 0.5% of muscle tissue. It's a very small percentage of what's going on. There's a lot of actin and myosin, etc. But having dystrophin messed up throws the whole system out of whack. There's no cure for muscular dystrophy. It's a disease that's very unfortunate. Maybe one day there will be a cure, but right now there are treatments for it, and it's something that you don't even think about dystrophin until there's a problem with it. Carpal tunnel might have genetic factors associated with it, but in general, when it comes to the carpal bones and the muscles here that help you move the fingers, there are these tracts made of muscles and tendons, nerves and blood vessels that go through the carpal bones to the fingers. Now, people who do a lot of typing, who do a lot of work, fine work with their hands, maybe they do arts and stuff like that for a living, those people would be a little bit more vulnerable because overuse of your fingers for hours on end can lead to getting carpal tunnel. And carpal tunnel is when you have a swelling of the sheaths, the connective tissue that's around these units, and that in these little tunnels is going to be pressing up against your nerves, your blood flow, and that swelling through these little narrow areas of the carpal bones is going to cause a lot of discomfort. It can start out as just a tingling, a numbness, but over time can get worse and worse and worse. Surgeries can help it, and there are also a lot of ergonomic devices out there that can help with carpal tunnel and minimizing it. Hernias is when part of an organ is creeping through some connective tissue, some compartment in the body, and going into an area where it doesn't belong. There are a few different types of hernias. One's an inguinal hernia. That's when part of your intestine is actually creeping through the muscular area that separates the scrotal sac from the abdominal cavity. So a man who gets an inguinal hernia, very painful. Sometimes it can be from just lifting something that's too heavy, and that overuse of the muscles in that region can cause that organ problem, and it can be very painful. Ischemia basically means blood starvation. So anytime you have a cutoff of blood to any organ, that's an ischemic kind of scenario. And when it comes to muscles require a lot of blood flow to function properly. So if blood's being cut off to a muscle, at the very least, you're going to get cramping, but at the worst, you can have cell damage. Botulism. Botulism is a result of a toxin causing the muscle to not be able to function properly. And one of the sources is a bacterium called Clostridium botulinum. This is something that's rare to get, but when you do get it, there's an incubation period that leads to the neuromuscular junctions not functioning properly because of that toxin. Polio comes from a virus, and that does eventually cause paralysis. I'm sure you're familiar with FDR and that particular disease. Because of vaccinations, you really don't see polio in the developed world, but it still does exist around the world in certain places. Tetanus. Tetanus is from a bacterial toxin. It can also be known as lockjaw, because what happens is if tetanus gets inside your body, there's an incubation period that leads to that toxin causing muscles to kind of be in a frozen, contracted position, and that's why the lockjaw would happen. There are shots that can help you not get tetanus. The typical scenario is stepping on a rusty nail, but you can get tetanus from other sources as well. The rusty nail makes sense though, because you have this metal object with the tetanus bacteria on it that is getting deep into your tissue, into where the muscle is. So that can cause the tetanus illness. Rotator cuff injury, someone who is a pitcher is probably more likely to get rotator cuff injury. But anytime you get a tear in the muscles that are surrounding the humerus and allowing you to have that nice ball and socket motion with that joint, that can be a problem. Mitochondrial diseases, once again, this is a genetic thing. You have a lot of different proteins in the cellular organelle known as the mitochondria that help shuttle protons, help shuttle electrons to where they're supposed to go to help you make ATP, the energy molecule required for muscles to function. If you have a mitochondrial disease, it could mean that you've inherited a certain DNA combination, a certain genotype that causes that protein to not be in the proper structure that it should be. And that can make it to where maybe you're not making as much ATP as you're supposed to be making in your mitochondria, and that can lead to certain problems throughout life. Compartment syndrome is related to ischemia because compartment syndrome is this scenario where if you have, let's say, a tear in a blood vessel that's in your gastrocnemius. Your gastrocnemius is surrounded with fascia and it's in its own little compartment. If you have a little bleed in that gastrocnemius unit, there could be a pressure buildup of all that blood, and all that blood just emptying into that compartment can put pressure on the muscle, the nerves, other blood vessels, and that swelling sometimes has no place to go because of that sheath known as the fascia. And so that compartment syndrome can cause permanent damage if you don't go to a hospital and get it taken care of. Probably the most fascinating of all muscular disorders I've ever heard of is FOP, fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva. That is depicted in this particular photograph here. This is a very rare disorder that has genetic factors linked with it. It's when if somebody with FOP gets injured, let's say they get in a car accident and they get tears in the muscles of their chest, muscles of their back, muscles of their arm, instead of their body healing that muscle to make muscle again, their body heals that tissue as bone. So you have a scenario here where this person, all these little injuries they've had on their arm and upper back and various parts of their body has led to bone being there where it doesn't belong. And that is going to lead to probably not living as long as the average person because these areas are going to constrict breathing in the long run. There are surgeries that they've tried to fix this, but if you think about what's required for a surgery, you have to go in surgically and maybe on a microscopic level damage certain tissues. So just the surgery itself could make the problem worse. So there's no current cure for FOP, but time will tell. And those are some muscular disorders. Thanks for watching educator.com.